on the program, it says the ontology of social services, but this grew and it's become very complicated. So I've been working on the ontology of services for many years, and with the distinction between goods and services. And I don't think it's possible to provide a good definition of either of these two terms which will please everybody. We have to make sacrifices at the edges, but I think that I've found a way of organizing a lot of the data that we have about goods and services in a way which is interesting and potentially also useful. And I want to use the word good to mean an independent continuant. I'll talk a little bit about the issue that Matt raised earlier about goods which are not independent continuants, but for the moment I want to focus on this case. And then I'm going to talk about services, and I'm going to suggest that there are really two kinds of services. On the one hand, there are what we might call pure services, which are just processes. But then on the other hand, there are the great majority of services which create things, and it will become clear what they create as we go along. Now, the starting point is national income statistics or gross domestic product statistics, and the official tables for gross domestic product start with these items. So personal consumption expenditures are divided into expenditures on goods. That means either durable goods like refrigerators or non-durable goods like hamburgers, and then services. So they are pretty clear that there are two different kinds of entity at work here. And they're interested in these kinds of entities because that money is involved. And I am primarily interested in these kinds of entities also because money is involved. But I think that the distinction holds even where no money is involved. So this distinction can be applied, for instance, to the charitable work of a convent, for instance. All right, so goods are material entities, and they're created by manufacturers and farmers and so forth. And then there are some people think there are immaterial goods. I don't have a finished view on this, but my current view says in the olden days, software was a material good. It was made of silicon and rubber and whatever floppy disks were made of. Today, you don't buy software. You rent it or you buy the rights to it. You pay a fee so that you can have the right to use the software. And the same, I think, applies to insurance. You pay a fee for the right to receive payments if you have a certain kind of loss. So you pay a fee, in essence, to gamble. And so I don't think these are good counterexamples to the idea that goods are material. But as I say, I have no finished view about this. Now, this is a little bit of philosophy here, so I apologize. One distinction that philosophers like to make is the distinction between intrinsic goods, which I'm here calling ultimate goods, which are good in their own right and not for another reason that they serve. So these are all intrinsic goods. You don't eat a hamburger because you want to bring about another effect. You eat a hamburger because the hamburger is a good in its own right. And similarly for all of these other things. So you don't read a novel because you want to achieve something else. You read the novel because reading the novel is good in its own right. Well, non-ultimate goods are goods that are involved in a chain of creation of ultimate goods. So the steering wheel is a good because it's going to become part of a car, which may be a good in its own right. And the design for a car is a good because it's going to be used as a design for building a car, which is a good in its own right. So there are goods which are goods for something, and then there are goods which are goods in their own right. And there are many on either side. And it's important to keep this distinction in mind. And if you want a little exercise, you might think about whether there is a distinction between ultimate services and services which are for something else. Goods have an economic value, but only if they enter into buying and selling processes. And buying and selling, unless you do it yourself, are services. So when you buy a car, this is a picture taken in the Max Heidegger AG, which is the BMW sales center in Liechtenstein. You deal with sales personnel who offer services. What did they bring about? They bring about a new pattern of ownership. Basically, before the transaction, you have the money and they have the car. After the transaction, it's reversed. All right, so there are buying and selling services, but there are many other kinds of what we will call pecuniary services. And here document acts come into play in a big way. So billing and securing payment and registering payment and ordering and auditing and processing claims, ranking hospital services, rankers of hospital services, and so on. All of these things are examples of services which have to do with the buying and selling, the price determining side of things. All right, now, goods are created, but then they're bought and sold, they're transported, if need be, to the purchaser, or maybe to the finisher, or maybe to the showroom where they can be shown to potential purchasers and so on. And then maybe they're protected, they're kept in a climatized garage or something, and they're maintained and repaired and restored and so on over the years. And then eventually they are demolished or destroyed or recycled, disposed of in some way. So there is a product life cycle. The creation is the first step in the product life cycle. Maybe there's a zeroth step, which would be design. Now, all of these things are services. So most of what goes on in the life of a product, a good, is a service or involves services one way or another. So these are services which are applied directly to material entities. So that's another kind of ultimateness. They are not applied to people, they're not applied to other services, they're applied to goods. And demolition is a service. I get $100 for every contract that the Bunker Hill services. And then we have protecting services. So you keep all your cars in a warehouse which is protected by watchmen and electronic fences and cyber security systems and so forth. So certainly in the early stages of the supply chain for expensive goods, there is a lot of protection going on. And then later on, there'll be more and different sorts of protection. All right, so goods are continuant, so they exist beyond the time in which they are created. So there's a common view, which I used to embrace, according to which services, all of services are occurrence. And I still embrace that view. The common view will come in a minute. So their process is performed by a service provider or by a company of service providers. And now the view which I used to embrace for all services says that they're all what I would now like to call pure services, which means that production and consumption coincide, at least temporarily, often spatio-temporally. So a medical interpreter provides a service of interpreting, and in providing that service is also consumed, basta, there is no leftover. And it's the same for a bodyguard. A haunted house tour guide provides a service, but you probably forget what you learned. So there's nothing left over. That may be memories which will fade, but nothing which has economic significance, for instance, from any of these pure services. I think pure services are a relatively small fraction of the entire empire of services. So now let's move to social work and general medical practice. Are these pure services? So they can, both of them, have outcomes, which means that they're not pure services. So in the one case, the doctor may give you a bottle of pills. In the other case, the social worker may give you a script which enables you to get money. And so both of them have alienable benefits. And so they're not pure services. So what about just advice? So you go to the doctor or to the social worker just to get advice. Then there are two cases. You ignore the advice or you accept the advice. If you ignore the advice, it's a pure service. It's a very, very weak and strange kind of nugatory pure service. If the advice is accepted, however, then there is something which survives. And this is the central thesis of the whole talk. What survives is, because you accept the advice to go running every day, or stop beating your wife or something, the person who receives the advice acquires a new disposition. And what that means is that something in that person's brain has changed. There's a new pattern in that person's brain, which serves as the basis for a disposition to go running every day or to stop eating chocolate or something. So pure services create no issue. They're relatively rare. And the common view, according to which services create nothing, says that all services are pure services. And we reject that common view with the view that nearly all services create specifically dependent continuums. They create patterns, quality patterns in, for instance, people's brains. So these are the classic examples of services. And they're all impure services in my sense. So the hairdresser creates a new pattern on your head. The gardener creates a new pattern in your garden, and the teacher creates a new pattern in your brain. And none of those patterns are alienable. You can't sell them or store them or rent them, but they're created by services. And that's why we pay money for those services, because of what they create, not because we enjoy watching the gardener or because we enjoy hearing the hairdresser's clips, but because we want the pattern. All right, now this fits into BFO as follows. The disposition has as its material basis a new quality, which is a pattern in the brain of the person who acquires the disposition. So we have material entities, which are people, families, goods, machines for creating goods or transporting goods, a pattern, which is a kind of quality, complex quality, capability, which I'll talk about next, which is a kind of disposition. The client of the social worker has the capability to go running every day. And then the service itself, which is a process. And now we can define capability. A capability is a disposition of a certain sort whose realization someone or some group, could be an organism of a non-human kind, but we'll focus on humans here, has an interest. So you all have an interest in digesting your food, and so you have a capability of digesting your food. Your digestive system has the function of digesting food, which is also a capability, but it's a special kind of capability. If you have an interest in the realization of a disposition, that disposition is a capability. We can now deal with hospital administration services in the same sort of way. So this is what we have, the simple services which have outputs, simple patterns, and the patterns are intrinsically valuable there. That's the idea. And these are all experts who have certain capabilities so that they're able to perform services which bring about these intrinsically valuable patterns. But now there are more complex services, such as hospital consulting services. And now we get a two-stage process. The hospital consultant bears the capability of the first type, which is realized in the consulting service, which has an output, a pattern in the hospital, which is the material basis of a second capability, which is the capability of the hospital itself to more smoothly run than they did before the consultant performed her service, if you're lucky. Now, we are going to have ultimate services, and the ultimate services are just the simple case, this case, just the one pattern step. And then non-ultimate services will be the ones which have multiple steps. In the case of the consultant, we have a two-step process. We could have, if you're teaching consultants to teach hospital managers how to run a hospital, that's a three-step process. Another hypothesis that I think is correct here is that many, perhaps nearly all non-ultimate services are performed to create new capabilities, either new capabilities in things or in organizations or in people. That's just a hypothesis, but I have a suspicion that it's going to hold in many cases. All right, now we can go and think about types of services in terms of the new proposal that's been presented. So we have pure services and we have pattern generating services. I think all services. So buying and selling, I said, yields new patterns of ownership. Now you can understand the significance of that thesis. So that we're dealing with services in general as creating patterns, and buying and selling our services, and they create patterns in a very obvious way. All right, now let's go back to the protect, restore, eliminate kind of approach. So we have this approach for goods. So we protect our new car, we restore our new car by repainting it, and we eliminate our car by disposing of it. But you can do these things also to patterns. So we may want to restore the pattern that was established in our garden by the famous landscape designer 100 years ago. And so we want to restore the same pattern, not the garden as a good now, but the pattern that was created by the landscape designer. And we may want to protect the knowledge that's acquired or the capability of our dog to catch beans. All right, but now we get another level of services, because these processes are services which are applied to patterns created by prior services. When they successfully restored the Darwin Martin house in Buffalo, they went for the original seeds of the same seed stock as were used by Frank Lloyd Wright to create the bushes in the gardens and so forth. And a lot of it had been sold when the house became decrepit during the period after the Second World War, I think by the wife of the then president of the University of Buffalo. She sold some of the windows, which now cost, if you can find one, they cost $17,000. Why do you want the original windows and the original bushes? In order to create the original pattern as near as you can get. It's the same universal, it's the same quality pattern, as near as matters. So if you want to get the same capability to play tennis that you had 10 years ago, they can be applied to patterns created by services, but the same distinction can be applied to patterns in general. So you may want to protect an ancient forest which has never been touched by forest designers. All right, now we can see how this works for different kinds of services. So teaching and training, the creating is the coaching, training in the gym, and so on. The pattern protecting is things like follow-up exams and promotion reviews. Pattern therapy is follow-up classes, more exercise. Pattern restoring is they send you back to school. And pattern eliminating is brainwashing. That's not a very good example, but Ryan came up with that example. But I thought it was good at the time. It's still good for some purpose. All right, now gardening is obvious. So you have anti-weed chemical spraying, tree doctor, historical garden restoration, and then eliminating the pattern would be weed removal. And dental, that's obvious. So creating the pattern is with veneers and caps. That's creative dentistry. And then protective dentistry is a mouth guard. Preventive dentistry is training in brushing and flossing. Restorative dentistry is restoring the correct pattern in your jaw through fillings. And then eliminative dentistry is removing the tooth. And medical in general, well, we have creative medicine, which is cosmetic medicine. And then protective medicine, which is diet and exercise therapy, for instance. Therapy itself, repairing, in other words, would be curing the infection, resetting the broken arm, or removing the tumor. So these are all types of medical services which involve something created, that your whole body was created in the first place by your parents. And then protecting what's created, repairing what's created, restoring what's created, or eliminating what's created, or bits of it. And so this is a picture of the healthcare supply chain. So you want to protect the services of the hospital. And that means you want to keep track of how all the bed linen and all the pharmaceutical supplies and all the patients and all the ambulances and all the fuel and so on are being delivered to the appropriate place in the supply chain at the appropriate time in order to keep the hospital and the ambulance service running. Not to mention the 911 service and so forth. And now this is the final slide. so to get back to social services, so creative social work is where the social worker provides advice, which in the successful case issues a new disposition on the side of the client. Protective social work is where the social worker reports the case to the Child Protective Services. That may be another partner for CBP. And then preventive social work is counseling the client on incipient family-related problems with the aim of preventing them from occurring. Restorative social work is social work with the goal of restoring those patterns which are characteristic of healthy family development. And then I couldn't think of an example of eliminative social work.
So my name is Bart Gajdarovich. I'm a postdoc at the University of Toronto at the Center for Social Service Engineering. And we work on essentially data standards and ontologies for interoperability between social services. And we focus on things like measuring impact of services and service provisioning on clients. And so this is really interesting work that that I've heard today, but also that Barry has been working on. And we kind of started this discussion at the JOA workshops. We had a workshop there on social services. And so, yeah, so this is really sort of interesting work in sort of defining services from maybe a different perspective or a different use case. But I really like the direction that this is going, Barry. So thanks very much.
And you don't have a question or a criticism?
I have 3 questions, actually, if there's time. One is, I'm trying to understand what a pattern is. Is it just a state that has some kind of structure?
So it's basically the idea of quality in BFO arises as follows. There are 2 kinds of attributes that things can have. One kind of attribute is what we call realizable, which means that it's not really there as something which is manifest, but it can be made manifest by some kind of external signal or process or some other means. So, and realizables, we divide into 2 parts: dispositions, which I've talked about just now, and then roles, which Matthias talked about. Matthias talked about earlier. On the other hand, are those attributes which are manifest all the time, to the extent that the bearer of the attribute has that attribute, and they're called qualities. And now patterns are just complex qualities. That's all we mean. So the kind of pattern that I'm thinking of primarily in many of these examples is a pattern in your brain. So that would be a very, very complicated electrochemical magnetic pattern. And whether that is, well, we don't use the word state as a technical term in BFO because we don't know what would be a good definition of state. But I think the example will give you a clue as to what we mean by a quality pattern.
Okay, great. My second question was, so this is sort of, that was left over from the previous workshop on social services, but you mentioned that a service is only something that is either, I think you said legislative or has some kind of monetary exchange. And so
no, I don't think I ever held that.
Okay.
What I said today was that I'm using examples of services which do have some kind of commercial or pecuniary significance, but I don't believe that the account I'm giving is exclusively going to hold for those kinds of cases. So I have I think a general view of service which is as general as your view of service. Okay,
so something like a community providing services to, or some people in a community providing, like, let's say, meal services to
yeah, that would be a service in my sense.
Okay.
No
and
problem.
The final question is this example of eliminative. I was trying to think if something like removing someone's addiction would be eliminative, but rereading your definitions here sounds like that would be more restorative.
Yeah, so I said that it was that the eliminative one was sometimes hard to find examples, and I can't find even one. But there is someone in the room who I think has an example
I wanted to offer eliminative could be interpreted as a non-ultimate service through the cessation of the social service itself.
But that wouldn't eliminate the problem on the part of the client. And all of the other cases have to do with the problem on the part of the client. And you're not going to say, kill the client. No.
That was said earlier.
Would it be maybe eliminating obstacles in the client's, I mean, if patterns are just in the client's mind, would it be eliminating sort of cognitive?
Yeah, I think that's preventive.
That would be preventive?
It sounds more like preventive. You're eliminating temptations, for instance.
Okay.
But as I say, I don't think that there is. I don't think it's a sound category, eliminative social service. It just doesn't feel right. I don't think it breaks everything, but it does mean that there is a weak point here.
Psychotherapy candidate.
So now I'm going out on a deep end, but let's suppose that you had a kind of psychotherapy which counseled people to commit suicide. And there have been cases in history where there were such kinds of people who went around counseling other people to commit suicide. But it's not a good idea. Yes?
I can think about pet examples, right?
Pet?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll use it.
Go ahead. I think he has another question. Then
Bert, yes? I think you're still on.
No, my hand I think is down and you've answered my questions. So
Okay,
thanks.
good.